guys are all going to work on. There are 3 different case studies. So what I'm going to have everyone who's not a panelist do is break up into groups, so 3 different groups. So if that table is a group, that table is a group, you 2 tables are a group, and you 3 people at that table can decide between those 2 groups, basically. So yeah, I mean, so basically break into 3 groups. I don't really care how you do it, so long as there is 3 of you. And then each group is going to get 1 case study, and I'll have someone from each group just sort of quickly summarize what the case study is. If you hate the case study, you can change to find somebody in another group to change to a case study with, but you're all adults and should be able to suck it up and work on the respective case studies. Or alternatively, if you feel like you have a real expertise in one of the other case studies and you really know nothing about the specific case study, then that is an acceptable reason to change. But basically, there should be an even balance. And then we're going to have the panelists join the groups and sort of provide their expertise and input. Everyone should identify 1 person to take notes and then 1 person to present out at the end. And what we're going to do is you guys are going to talk about this for, let's call it 40 minutes now because we're behind. And then 1 person from each group will come up and present your findings, and we'll ask a couple of questions, and that's really it. And the goal or the hope is that we can come out from these conversations with something that people can continue to work on outside of this conference. So I will quickly hand round. So if everyone wants to, their assigned person to present out wants to come up to the front. So 1 person from each group. Anyone want to go first? No? Excellent. And so, prisons or jails or whatever we're calling you, did you guys have a person? Anyone? Did you not listen to the instructions at the beginning where I specifically said you need to assign a person to come up and present at the end? Okay. You're making that face like you really didn't want to do it, but you were going to do it. So, do you want me to? No, everyone, you can just sit down for a second, and then I am going to have. So Rosemary is going to MC this or moderate this part of the conversation. So if you just want to say a little bit about who you are and what you guys do, and then find out what each group worked on and what they concluded.
Great, thanks, Imogen. This is a very difficult assignment for me because I've been part of a wonderful group talking about our case study, but I'll try and be impartial. My name is Rosemary Ripley. I'm a managing director at NGen, and we are growth equity investors. We invest in sustainability. And do we think we really need this?
Well, they're recording.
We do. Okay. We invest in better for you brands and sustainable products and services. We've raised 3 funds, and we do not just invest in Yonkers, which is the topic of our case study, but we do invest in North America, so United States and Canada mainly. So, okay, I get to be a moderator, which means that I get to hear from each of our wonderful panelists here talking about these 3 fascinating cases. So why don't we just go in order, if that's all right? Deirdre, I think it's good to have a little context, don't you? Do you want to just say a word or 2 about yourself, each of you, and then what the case is and what our conclusions so far are, or our recommendations, depending on the assignment?
Here we go. That's better. Hi, I'm Deirdre Hess Gibson. I'm making a transition. I am with Eventide Asset Management, which, as far as I'm aware, aside from Calvert, might be the only mutual fund here today. So I'm on the side where I get to run around talking with people's financial advisors and putting impact in the hands of retail investors, which is very exciting for me. Our table was our case study. It was around a fellow named Bob, who's recently sold his impact bakery, where he hired all kinds of women and minorities and I forget who else, and formerly incarcerated people. So he's got some great experience, and now he's got $100 million in his pocket, and he wants to invest in his town of Yonkers, where he lives. And the summary of what we came up with for him comes down to, first, we want Bob to find his experts. So a good financial advisor to help him develop a good place-based investment strategy, which is an impact place-based investment strategy, which is a challenging person to find. So good luck to Bob on that. And the second one that we thought he should develop, what we called a Bob Advisory Board, or BAB. And the people in Bob's BAB should be local people who are members of the various groups that he's trying to help. So, and again, I should have brought the piece of paper up, but it's the sort of people you could probably guess. So it's women, it's minorities, it's immigrants, it's formerly incarcerated people. Did I miss any? Right, and he cares about economic inclusion, health and education, and the employment empowerment of women and minorities. So, he's got some experience in the area he cares about, but it's still very important to talk with the folks on the ground, who's doing what's working well, what's working poorly. We also had a variety of organizations along the way that can help inform his work. So BALI, which is the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, I remembered what it stood for. They find local fellows, so maybe BALI can help him find a Yonkers fellow who's unofficial mayor, that sort of thing. So that's find your experts. Second is we came up with slices of his portfolio pie. How big the slices are, we decided that's up to Bob and his financial advisor, but these are sort of the three main slices. Equity, fixed income, and charitable are the three categories. Within the equity slice, we really think he can make use of his experience with investing in local businesses. I think we learned from the Grameen talk this morning that actually a small amount of money can go quite a long way with some of these things. So that might be ones that are already there, relocations, entrepreneurs. He can be an advisor as well as an investor. Microfinance can be part of it. We're not sure if Bob is willing to take a chunk of the money and put it in the sort of public equity markets or not. So that's a conversation yet to be had, but that could fall into the equity piece. In the fixed income side, he could clearly partner with CCM. They're doing local muni bonds. They can help him find the ones that are going to have good impact and hopefully skirt some of the local city management that might not be doing so great. And then on the charitable side, there was sort of a variety of ideas we threw on. Some things that could be directly local parks, things like that, again, advised by his BAB, local nonprofits that are doing good work, and then the local community foundation is probably already aware of which nonprofits are really doing a good job. Maybe a donor advised fund is a good choice for him so that he can, he can do his giving at the time when it makes the most sense. You're going to have more flexibility with the timing. And then eventually, with all this experience, Bob should probably run for office. So. That's what we got.
That's excellent. I'm Lisa Davis. I'm with PGIM Real Estate, which is one of the Prudential asset management companies, and I lead their impact investment strategies there. So I'm a real estate developer and financier, I guess, which is why I ended up with this job of reporting out. Our case was a prison closure called Tyker's Island. And the question is, once this prison closes, how do we address the needs of 2,000 people, mostly African-American men aged between 40 and 60, in the community? And how do we keep them out of the medical system, out of the prison system, and out of all of the systems that cost a lot of money? Fortunately, we had a great expert talking with us about what the proven solutions are for this problem. So Imogen from Open Society Foundations had a lot of information for us around what works, which is really important in a situation like this, because I feel like we all bring our ideas to it, which may or may not be related to what actually works for people. because we actually spend about most of our time talking about that, like what works. But the proven thing that reduces involvement with all of these systems is housing, and specifically service-enriched housing. The problem is that the housing system in New York City, including the homeless system, is incredibly overtaxed, overused, underfunded, and doesn't really have a lot more space for 2,000 more high needs individuals to come into it. So we started talking about what might the other funding sources be for that, and there were some leading questions on our sheet around bonds. And then of course, we had a whole conversation about the failure of the last New York City recidivism social impact bond. But we think we could come up with a solution which might be a lot more successful here. The basic idea would be if we could issue a bond that would be paid for by the kind of three series of agencies that were paying a lot of money for these folks cycling in and out of their various systems. So healthcare, prisons, and rehab. Did I get those systems? Shelter. Oh, well, yes, shelter. Although I think we sort of determined that the shelter system is already incredibly overtaxed, so maybe not a huge source of revenue. And we also talked about the idea that we need a capital source to capitalize the housing, but also an ongoing revenue source to support the operations and the supportive services that people living in this housing will need. And I guess there's a source at the state for many of the services, and we thought we'd go to that for the operations and services, but that we'd try and come up with some sort of bond that would capitalize the debt needed for building or purchasing the housing units. The challenge is how do you get the agencies to pay the bonds? Because you're essentially asking them to pay for money that they're not spending. If they're not spending it on Medicare or medical care or shelter or for prison for these folks, how do you get them to pay a bond instead? So we spent a bunch of time talking about that. And so I think what we came up with was that maybe one of the state agencies that has bonding and guarantee capacity could issue a bond, and that there could be a bilateral agreement with the agency that this was costing the most from, who are the private health administrators, insurance companies. And so the state could could issue the bond and do the guarantees and the credit enhancement, and they would then go to the private health insurance companies to pay for the bond. I'm sure they would be totally willing to do that, but maybe we could have a pilot to prove to them how much this actually saved them. And of course, there's the whole problem of how do we demonstrate success and measure success so that then the health insurers would be paying for that success. The other idea that we thought about for the capital stack of building the housing was to bring in some private equity investors, maybe family offices or philanthropic investors, to make equity investments in the housing. As we think that a lot of this housing is going to be in opportunity zones, that there might be some tax benefits available to offer those investors as well. Did I miss anything? Thanks.
I'm Laura Heary. I'm an architect in a very small foundation called the Live, Work, Walk Foundation, which fits this exercise. So in Hawaii, with an opportunity zone in the context of being the first state in the U.S. to entirely switch to renewable power, we started with distributed generation, larger scale renewable, and even tying into ocean-based generation and a lot of rooftops for solar. And where to do that? How about anchoring it with the hospital that has need for backup water, backup power, and to be an emergency transfer point? All over the United States, there are ETPs that are defined by Department of Homeland Securities, and can we stack a little bit of budget to be prepared for emergency with even food as a backup, not just water and power, and additional facilities and some fortification for structure. So workforce housing next to hospitals is actually quite in demand. It might not be so hard to ground lease a surface parking lot and have for not too much cost going into the land for a developer to be happy enough to do some workforce housing and also senior housing. And so we visualize a place-based strategy that has a piazza that is maybe a place to store water, a storm water park underneath, and some market square locations so that when you grow some pineapples locally, you can come get those on a Saturday or a Sunday. And that overall, you've put together a health improvement district such that you're combining different ages, different incomes, actual demand for work, around preparedness for weather event or even cyber disruption, going into an islanded state. But a pretty happy day-to-day life, schools co-locating, and basically everyone at the table would have some role because there's plenty of room when you have a place-based strategy.
Well, here's a question maybe for the group, and we can decide how we want to handle it. But it seems to me one of the things that's interesting about these three cases is that they have multi-dimensions to them, and they call for the intersection across sectors, sort of government, corporates, individuals. And one of the challenges is I feel like the United States is moving from a world where government would say, we're going to solve the following problem, and we're going to go spend a lot of money on X, Y, or Z, depending which problem we're talking about. And that model has kind of shown itself to be a very expensive model. And part of what we're talking about today here, and then I think broadly at the conference, is using investment dollars to try and get at solutions that government previously tried to get at. So the question is, how do we think as the old world fractures and a new world comes up, is there a world for government to do more to incent private investment, whether it's corporate or individual, in these socially based activities? Panel first, or whoever, however we want to handle it.
Well, I just have a little thought on that I want to share based on actually the conversation Andrea and I were having when we first came into the room. She's a municipal credit analyst. And we were talking about the fact that, oh gosh, you would probably answer this question actually better than me, that one of the things that came up around our table is that you run into challenges when you're trying to direct money in a place and the local government is mismanaging. And actually, municipal credit analysts are looking at that long-term view and sort of the quality of a place, and are they making good decisions over time? So, I mean, I think which actually to me says it's a two-way street of how are we holding each other accountable, and that's part of the question. Like, maybe we'll incentivize private investment by getting your own house in order is maybe part of the answer.
I have a really ideological answer to this that I probably should keep to myself. So, so even in the case of social impact bond, I mean, first of all, we operate in a framework of a market that is determined by government regulations, whether it's stocks and bonds, or whether it's low-income housing tax credits, or whether it's welfare payments. Like, it's all public policy. It's all a government-controlled regulatory framework. So to say that the private sector is going to suddenly solve all of these things, it actually is doing that in the framework of existing public policy, and we get to decide the public policy if we're lucky. So, you know,
so the question was, should we be asking our governments to do more in a different way? Not just giving handouts, but I mean, obviously tax code is one thing.
Yeah, I mean, the tax code is very powerful, and we can use it to make rich people richer, or we can use it to support a social safety net. And I think it's pretty clear what decisions are being made right now. And I think that it still comes back to we have to influence public policy to create an equitable society. It's not.
But it could also be used maybe to make incentive for people to actually invest in community-based.
Sure. Yeah.
Forms of business.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, I would say if you boil down public responsibilities to its minimum, infrastructure is something that's hard for a lot of individuals to do. I mean, there was a time where streetcars were done where a lot of different private streetcar owners, but they didn't actually meet. So it's helpful when the public sector plays its infrastructure role and is mature beyond it being single purpose. So we've lived through a few decades where streets were designed for one purpose only, throughput. They were measured by their throughput. They were graded by their throughput. But once you start to look at it from a multidisciplinary use, can you actually walk? Can you live on it? Can an old person cross the street? Can you sit there? That's an infrastructure that has multiple purposes, and in fact starts to have greater fiscal efficiency in terms of how are you using those dollars. Are you able to have some kind of density? Do you get a bigger tax base off of it as opposed to disconnected sprawl development patterns? Similarly, will you start to see a neighborhood or an area thrive because the infrastructure allows it to be multifunctional? So I think the place-based expectation on whether it's a Department of Transportation to be context sensitive, to look at can you do multiple activities. What about Main Street? You know, I think that Main Street versus Wall Street, it has some pretty simple notions that most people feel they lost their Main Street along the way. And why was that? And it actually was the way public infrastructure was designed. So I would put a greater responsibility to measuring that infrastructure for now resilience, as well as fiscal benefit, as well as multiple investment value, as opposed to just, can you get from here to there?
Listen, I have a table of fantastic women over here on the left, and if it's anything like the rest of all of you, I'm sure you guys have some great questions, and we should start a dialogue. So, Chloe, do you want to ask some questions or get people started more broadly talking? I think it's sort of boring to sit and just watch 3 or 4 of us talk. So, I mean, does anyone else have some questions or a question that you'd like to pose to the group? Or about one of the cases? Something? Come on, Mary, you're so chatty. Come on. I'm passing the talking mic.
Yeah, I did have 2 thoughts, thanks. The first one was there's a common theme that I picked up on, which was the need to ask experts because the problems are complex. So it just came across to me that none of us should think we have all the answers or really, in a way, any of the answers to a real world, real life complex problem. And that's why I think an event like this is so useful because we get to cross-pollinate ideas and expertise. I'll pass it on to anybody else, but thanks for your standing up there and spelling out our case studies and solutions. I learned a lot listening to you all 3. Anybody else want to comment?
Hi, everyone. Piggybacking, Mary, off of what you said, part of what I think is so interesting about being in this social impact space is thinking about who it is we're trying to impact and how do we know we're impacting them in the way they'd like to be impacted. Because everyone in this room, I don't know you all, but I know we all have some degree of power and privilege to be here. And I think it's really interesting. I know, Imogen, you work a lot with people who you represent who are on the other side of this equation. And I'm curious how everyone else in their practices have been in touch with that other side. Because it's something that we're, as a real estate development company with real assets in specific places, it's very simple. We do very standard things like community meetings and talking to people about what they want to see. But I'm curious how this works in your sector. So if anyone has a comment about that, I'd love to hear it.
The room is so quiet, I can't stand it. So I'm Lori Scott, I'm with MacArthur Foundation, and we primarily make program-related investments, some mission-related investments, but all with some sort of concession in order to create some sort of special impact. And for instance, in answer to your question, we're putting together a new strategy, a new global investment strategy. And one of our criteria is how do our prospective investees bring the community voices or the beneficiary voices into their work. So it's a gating criteria for us as investors because we believe that the people who benefit from this, they don't have to know anything about finance, but if they're not really getting the kind of impact that they really need or value, then we probably really shouldn't be financing it. So, anyone else?
Can I ask a question? No. When you say it's a gating criteria, like what is the gate? Like what do they have to be doing and how do they have to be doing it?
Everyone wants their coffee. So it depends because we're investing across business models in different geographies, and it's very broad. So there's no pat answer, but so we want to listen to how they do that. And if they're not, then it's kind of go develop it and come back. So it can take many different forms, from connecting with the clients or the beneficiaries to get feedback, and that they incorporate that into their business model and adjust what they're doing in order to improve it, or to have representation within the governance or decision making. It can take a lot of different.
So, I mean, do you think, broadly speaking, that this is something that the investment community does well enough, or specifically that the impact investment community does well enough? And what could it do better to engage those other stakeholders? The sort of the stakeholder engagement to ensure that yeah, and that you're sort of having that you're being informed in your impact and having the impact that you want to have, as opposed to sort of taking a top-down approach, which imposes ideas onto people.
I have thoughts and ideas. I don't know if these directly answer your question, but I will say, so as I said, I'm fairly new with Eventide. I was at Heron Foundation before, which some of you are probably familiar with. And one of the reasons I was excited to go there was, because it is giving the opportunity to retail investors to participate in this. And I get sometimes sad and frustrated that it seems like in our spaces, all of the opportunities are for high net worth or institutional clients. So I think that that's an important piece of the pie. But I also was excited because what Eventide is doing is looking at both the products and services side and the operations in a sort of multi-stakeholder, like all of the stakeholders, which there are 6 buckets. I think they're big enough to include everyone, but it's customers, employees, suppliers, local communities, the environment, and sort of society broadly. And I think, we spent a lot of time here today in other panels talking about, impact measurement, and there's a lot of metrics and a lot of frameworks out there. And I was at the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit yesterday, and it was the same thing. And at Eventide, I think there's a recognition that, especially on the smaller end of the scale, like sort of small cap growth companies is a big space we're in. You don't have all the metrics, but you can still be asking the gut level questions that point you in the right direction of, like, do employees love their jobs? We might not know everything about how the gender and inclusion and diversity, like all of the details and all the metrics, they might not have the metrics yet. But if they're being led by a great management team who really cares about their people and are creating a great culture, then maybe those things will come along in due course. But I think that, to summarize why I thought this was an important answer to your question, the challenge is that actually we need to look at all of the things all of the time, but we can't, it's not possible to do that with a depth into all of the data. But if we're at least having an eyeball on, are the products and services like supporting human flourishing, and is the operation of the company supporting human flourishing, we're going to go in the right direction regardless of what asset class we're in.
Sort of a danger that impact veers too much towards measurement and frameworks and not enough towards sort of outcomes and common sense.
I think there's a danger that we'll spend too many years tying ourselves in knots and not permitting ourselves to move forward. I'm not saying that that's unimportant or that we shouldn't be doing it, but we also shouldn't let it stop us now.
I sort of want to add to that, because I think that we are in danger a little bit from time to time, depending on which organization we're talking about, having the perfect be the enemy of the good on some of these topics. And when it comes to measurement, the thought that you have to have a perfect framework to measure incremental impact, I think can stymie new investment and can stymie dollars coming into these sectors. And I love the quote, I think it was our former president who said, "The arc of history bends towards freedom." I think the arc of history bends towards a lot of good being done. I think we're on balance, although I sometimes say we're one of the worst species, I think on balance we're a good species. And I think that we are getting there, but it's incremental. And so with respect to measuring across all stakeholders, as we look at our companies, there are, we may have one investment that is doing a great job taking sugar out of diets, or another company that's doing a great job getting healthy meals out there for kids in schools. And these things have huge impacts. They may sound relatively like a small, tiny thing, but if you can, guess what? If you can feed kids who are previously not being fed good quality food, of course their health goes up, but so too do their scores and performance in school, surprise, surprise. So there's good data around all of these things. So I think the ability to measure take performance in school based on eating healthy food, that took a while to get that stat out there and done on a reasonably objective, enough of a population base, et cetera, to have the right result. So I think I think we have to be leery and cautious of our institutions putting this broad area of investing into a box that no other investment really fits against. Because we're supposed to make money, some of us, as well as doing good. So, and I could spend, I could have 2 full-time people doing nothing but figuring out how much incremental good we're doing. And meanwhile, I won't be able to invest as much money, et cetera, and probably will hurt my returns too.
I just wanted to maybe say one last thing about this question of how do we make sure that we're paying attention to the feedback of the folks that we are trying to serve. And I think one of the key elements of that is to ensure that our organizations and our vendors are representative of the people that we serve to the greatest extent possible in terms of gender and background and race and ethnicity, and that, that's part of why we're here today. That's part of the task here, and that diversity and inclusion also have an impact on making sure that we can accomplish our goals in a big way.
And I would come back to if we see overarching recurrent issues of affordability, of when there is development, that there's displacement, that when wonderful programs get established, do you get the stacking effect that the job has been created, the mission has been accomplished, but is it also feeding into a community of that's richly dimensioned? I would say one thing that we have going for us now that we didn't have 20 years ago or 10 years ago even was that this is a market-supported approach to actually, whether it's millennials or baby boomers, to want to have physical community. And that the more deliberately, whether it's foundations or investors, private or public sector, recognize that there is a huge demand. The reason we have problems with affordability is because, or the ability to live in a live, work, walk environment, is because there's so few of them, that we zoned them out of existence, we infrastructured them out of existence, we've discarded our main streets. And the more that the broad array of philanthropic work finds itself to add to its criteria, does it think about place? And our former president had a great quote that place is a determinant of economic and physical well-being. And so I come back to that these opportunity zones, are they kind of a vague area that you might pave some great roads? Or will they build on these decades of discovery, of stacking place from many different perspectives and disciplines?
It seems like that is the crucial question for opportunity zones, right? It's going to come down to sort of the intentionality of the investors and the capital allocators and the managers and that. Chloe, you looked like you had something to say. Okay. So I think we're pretty much at time, so you can be released into warmer climates. Thank you, everyone.